It is a great pleasure, and indeed a great honor, for me to welcome you tonight to the formal inauguration of the first edition of the Master Program in European Economic Governance, Law, Politics and Economics of Carlos III University. Let me start this brief presentation with a story. In the Greek mythology, Euro was one of the gods of the directional winds, in particular the god of the winds that came from the east. We have two Greeks here with me. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It was said that Euro brought warmth and also rain so that the ground could be purified and become fertile. However, it was also said that Euro could bring, in some occasions, heavy storms and even tempests. When Professor Sanchez Cuenca, Mayoral, Ciotis and me started speaking 2 years ago about the possibility of setting up a master program in European economic governance, we agreed that the essence of the program should be to teach the master's students not only the virtues of European economic governance, but also the less virtuous aspects. Not only the warmth and rain of the Euro, as it were, but also its capacity to originate heavy storms and tempests. This is what has inspired us and what will inspire us in the coming years. We want to provide our students with an in-depth, technical, but also very critical education about many intricacies of European economic governance. I also would like to make a reference tonight to the past, when the four of us started speaking about the need to set up this program. We were in the middle of the pandemic, and the prospects for our country, for Europe, and for the world were rather somber. Nevertheless, we decided to go ahead. Further in time, the very day that the program was launched, Russia decided to invade Ukraine. However, and despite this, we decided once again to go ahead. And here we are today at the inauguration ceremony of the first edition of the Master Program in European Economic Governance in Madrid at Carlos III campus in Puerta de Toledo. The words of late President Kennedy, when he decided to plant a man in the moon, never were truer before. We chose to go to the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard, President Kennedy said. Well, we decided to go ahead with this program, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Sometimes hardship gives men and women a measure of what they are capable of achieving. I hope that as students of this program, you will always bear in mind this important thought. The program that we have ahead of us tonight is very special, or was very special. I will speak about that a little bit later. We have with us, first of all, Professor Loukas Tsoukalis as keynote speaker. Professor Tsoukalis is one of the most renowned experts in European Union economics, and in particular in the economics of the Eurozone. We could not have had a better guest speaker tonight. Loukas is not only highly original and analytical in his takes about European economic governance, but also he has a very wide practical experience in the field. Among his many academic achievements, I would like to highlight that he is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Athens. He is an affiliated Professor of Economics in Sciences Po, Paris. He has been visiting professor at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, the European University Institute in Florence, and he has been advisor to a number of presidents of the European Commission. He has recently published Europe's Coming of Age. It's there, but that one is my copy. Thanks, Loukas, for honoring us with your presence here tonight. He's going to speak in just a few seconds about the future of European economic governance. The second speaker, and I say this word between inverted commas, is Julie Sévilla Fraisse. Julie is one of the most exemplary young classical music cello performers of the world. She was born in Nice, studied at the prestigious Conservatoire National Supérieur de Musique de Paris, at the Juilliard School in New York, and at the Reine Elisabeth Music Chapel in Belgium. And she's currently a member of the Opéra de Paris. Among her many achievements, Julie has performed with great artists such as Abdelrahman El-Bachar, Raji Pasquier, Nicolas Angelic, Gary Hoffman, and still others. The only problem is that we have a strike of air controllers in France. So it's very sad to say that she's not with us in person tonight. She is online somewhere. I don't know if you can hear us. Julie? No, she can't. Okay. This is going to be an experiment. So as you know, there was an air controller strike in France, which has complicated our life. We will try to have her, be it online. She has recorded also some stuff, but I'm not sure if we'll be able to make it. Anyway, we'll see. Not everything can be under control. We know that already. Okay, so as I said before, this is a very special occasion, not only for the quality of the speakers, not only for the particularities of the program that we have or try to have ahead of us, at least Loukas is here with us, but also because we are here and we can say to that yes, we've made it. The ensuing program is only an expression of the important moment that we are living tonight. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much, Antonio, for your kind words of introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come to Madrid, to Spain in general. So I've been asked to talk about European economic governance and how it may develop in the next few years. But one thing I've learned in life is that before you start making predictions about the future, you need to understand where you come from and where you are today. So what I propose to do is, before making hazardous predictions about the future, say a few words about the European journey until now, stressing what I consider to be the main points, then move on to discuss where we are today as the European Union, as Europe more generally, and then move on to my dangerous exercise in predicting the future. Now, if you look back, the European journey that has now lasted more than 70 years, and what I mean by the European journey is the European integration project that begins in 1950. Okay? The first thing that strikes you is the remarkable expansion in terms of functions and members. If you look back over 70 years, this is the first thing that comes out very clearly. This is a project that has expanded dramatically from two sectors, coal and steel, to just about everything. Everything that is competence of government forms part of the European agenda, although with very different forms and models of decision-making, and this is to make it more complicated and provide jobs for experts of the European Union. And it is also a project that started with 6, now has 27. We lost UK on the way, which has been perhaps arguably the biggest setback in European integration so far. And there are more in the waiting room to join. Now, Again, if you look back, this remarkable expansion has certainly not been linear. There's been many ups and downs and lots of crises. And in fact, in the last 10 years or so, we have seen nothing but recurring crises, one after the other. A friend of mine, a colleague in Brussels, calls it a state of perma-crisis. A perma-crisis, which is not only the European Union, but it is a perma-crisis for individual European countries. Now, first question, therefore, that arises is, why is it? Why is it that a project has expanded so remarkably? Now, those who don't like European integration, who want to adhere to national sovereignty, often talk in terms of the conspiracy of the Illuminati, conspiracy of this Brussels cabal that's been struggling for 70 years with remarkable success to undermine national sovereignty, to undermine our sacred nation state in Europe. Now, to be fair, there's been conspiracy of the Illuminati all along, much more in the beginning than afterwards. But to believe that this expansion of the project is due to a continuous conspiracy is to believe anything in life, okay? So let us then look at other, more plausible explanations. It has something to do, surely, with economic functionalist logic. You start by integrating one sector, you create the conditions and the needs to expand integration into other sectors, to deepen, for example, you start by eliminating tariff barriers, then non-tariff barriers appear, then all kinds of unfair competition appear because of tax competition or what so on and so forth. So it is an economic process that has an inherently expansive logic. Okay? That helps to explain part of it, but certainly not all of it. For those of you who are lawyers, who will also understand that the legal construction is also inherently expansive, especially the way the European Court of Justice has interpreted the treaties. Okay? And that also has something to do with the expansion. But more than anything else, I believe, it is changes in the environment. It is what Harold Macmillan, an old former Prime Minister of the UK, referred to as events. He was asked once, what does he think is the most important factor in politics? And he answered, events, my dear boy, events. Now, it is events that have shaped European integration, and it was not conspiracy. To give you examples, in the southern enlargement is the result of the fall of dictatorships in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. The European community at the time had very little to do with it. But the fall of the dictatorships created not only the conditions for further enlargement, but also put the European Union into a different sphere, namely to discuss not only economic prosperity, but also democracy and modernization. Because the countries that joined the European community at the time, namely Spain, among others, had fragile democratic institutions and economically were less developed and closed. So by entering the European community, they also forced the European community to expand its own agenda. And then, even more importantly, the end of the Cold War, the fall of Berlin Wall, and the disintegration of the Soviet Empire that has brought economic and monetary union and the Big Bang enlargement of the European Union. More recently, it was the pandemic that has created the first example of mutualization of aid, of debt in the European Union. And now the war in Ukraine is probably going to prove the next most important factor shaping European integration in the years to come. Now, European integration started, no doubt, as a peace project. It was about reconciliation of old foes, essentially France and Germany. The project was about two countries. That's how it starts. But it was also a peace project relying mostly on economic means to achieve largely political ends. And therefore prosperity was part of the agenda. So it was peace and prosperity. And then, as I mentioned before, the addition of countries with more fragile democratic institutions and less developed economically brought democracy and modernization and development aid to the picture. So Pax Europea became, or rather the European project became the means to export Pax Europea to less developed and less stable parts of the European continent, increasingly so as the years went by. The European project is about common institutions and rules. It is about long negotiations and compromise. So for those who are not patient, they don't like the European Union. The European Union is a very tiresome and often boring-looking enterprise, where many people are engaged in endless negotiations to achieve compromises and consensus. And it is about the sharing of sovereignty. It is, I believe, a radical political experiment, arguably the most radical political experiment in the world in the last 50 years, because it is about countries that have invented national sovereignty trying to share it. And in that respect, it is a revolutionary political experiment, and more successful than other political experiments we have witnessed in the last 50 and more years. Now, the other thing to add is that European integration begins essentially as an inward-looking project. Remember, in the 1950s, in the 60s, in the 70s, European integration was taking place in the context of the Cold War, which divided the European continent into two parts, and Western Europe was under the military protection of NATO and the United States. So European integration was taking place in the cocoon of NATO and under US military umbrella. And then this inward-looking project began to look outwards increasingly. Why? I think for two reasons. First of all, those who were in the European community and then later the European Union began to realize that strength was drawn from unity. That even the European community of 6, even more so of the 9, of the 12, of the 15, of the 20-odd, realized that they had negotiating strength wherever they were united. And this is, in fact, the most important reason that the Brits back then decided to join the European community, because they realized that in GATT negotiations, it was the Americans talking to the European community, and the British were left in second rank. So it was the existence of a common market that was the source of the negotiating strength of the Europeans. But it also became more outward-looking because the world changed. And the world changed not only because of the fall of dictatorships in the South, but even more so. I mean, the biggest turning point, if you look back over the 70 years, what is the biggest turning point? It is the end of the Cold War. It is the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of not only the USSR, but the Soviet Empire that extended all the way to Berlin. Because it is the fall of the end of the Cold War that explains economic and monetary union. Economic and monetary union was essentially a Franco-German project to reconcile German unification with further European integration. It was a French project, it was a French initiative to deal with what was called then a German problem. economic and monetary union would not have happened without the fall of the Berlin Wall. It had been tried before. In fact, I have some personal experience. I don't know whether it's experience. I wrote my doctoral thesis in Oxford on European monetary integration. And I did that when I was young and innocent. And when I was finishing my doctoral thesis, Economic and Monetary Union, which was a project of the 1970s, believe it or not, Europeans had decided that they would have a complete economic and monetary union by 1980. Of course, it never happened, because if it had happened, you probably would have heard about it. So it failed abysmally. And my thesis came out with a failure. And at that time, I was daring enough, because I was young, to actually argue that this dead duck, as they call it in English, was going to be revived. And I was trying to put forward explanations, reasons, economic and political, why monetary union was going to come back to the European agenda in the future. It did come back on several occasions, but the only time it succeeded was because of geopolitics. It was because of German unification and the Cold War. And the fall of the Berlin Wall not only created economic and monetary union, but also turned a European Union from 15 members to 27 and more, because the European project expanded to the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So that has been certainly the biggest, the most important turning point for Europe, because it changed the economic and political order in Europe. Now, we have another big crisis, because we now have the end, I believe, of the post-Cold War order. The war in Ukraine signifies the end of the post-Cold War order set by those who won the Cold War, namely the United States and the Western Alliance. What follows still remains to be seen. It's a subject that we could, if you want, think and discuss as to what may follow. Now, the centerpiece of European integration is still the so-called single market, or what the lawyers call the four fundamental freedoms. If you think about it, it is rather strange that the four fundamental freedoms for the European Union is the free movement of goods, services, persons, and capital. I mean, it may make sense to lawyers, it may make sense to economists, but it doesn't sell. I mean, try to sell to people the idea that the European Union is essentially about the free movement of goods, services, persons, and capital. And then people, at best, they yawn, right? Now, the four fundamental freedoms remains the centerpiece of European construction. And it is there where the old community method still more or less operates. The Commission proposes, the Commission manages, the Council disposes, and the European Parliament has increasing powers intervening in the process of decision-making. Now, the European single market began essentially as a liberalization project, and that's what it is mostly. It is about the elimination of barriers. But in the process, the Europeans had to try to find a compromise between three things: liberalization, regulation, and development aid, or redistribution, whatever you like to call it. So the European single market is not only about liberalization, it is about rules, and it is also about structural funds. Structural funds is the European jargon for development aid. And it was part of the package. Structural funds were developed in the 1980s as part of the single market package, and it was the product of Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors, remember, was a French socialist, the most successful president of the European Commission ever, never elected, French socialist president of the European Commission, never elected, and who understood that liberalization had to go hand in hand with development and redistribution. And he succeeded in getting the package through. Now, as a result of the single market, the European Union has developed into a trade superpower, which it is, and it has been for a long time. Because if you manage and represent a market of fairly prosperous 450 million consumers, everybody's forced to take you seriously. Everybody. Nobody can ignore the European market. No single multinational can simply ignore its access to the European markets. And that has made the European Union, for years, not only now, a trade superpower that can speak and negotiate on more or less equal terms with the United States, with Japan, and now with China. The European Union has also developed into a regulatory superpower because the European Union has become a regulatory power. In fact, in many areas, European standards are among the highest in the world. And because the Europeans set those standards, and because you have to respect those standards to have access to the European market, those standards often influence international standards. So Europe has become a trade superpower, a regulatory superpower. But then, of course, the European Union is not only a single market, it is also a monetary union. But remember, a monetary union not for everybody. Because with Maastricht onwards, the European project becomes a project that relies increasingly on differentiation. Some countries join the projects, others don't. It's not only Maastricht, it's Schengen, it's increasingly in many areas where integration does not operate on the basis of erga omnes. Okay? Some people join, some countries, join, others don't. Now, economic and monetary union was the next big qualitative step in European integration, because you moved from trade, services, regulation, liberalization, to macroeconomic policy. Now, the Maastricht construction was a strange construction in many ways. It was certainly asymmetrical. The Maastricht construction essentially meant that monetary policy was transferred completely to the union level, and the responsibility for it was given to independent technocrats, appointed on a long-term basis, and with very little political accountability. It was the time that everybody believed in central bank independence. Okay? And fiscal policy remained highly decentralized, with some rules that were supposed to enforce a minimum of coordination among members. Now, the Maastricht construction went through a big trial with the financial crisis of 2007-8, when the international financial crisis coming from the United States turned into an existential European crisis. It was ironic in a sense that the crisis hit Europe when Europe was celebrating the 10 years anniversary of the euro. And the poor Commission had published a report rejoicing about the great success of the euro project. And then hell was let loose. Many people at that time predicted that that was the end of the euro, and perhaps also of the European construction. They were proven wrong. because essentially those who predicted the fall, the disintegration of the European monetary construction, underestimated consistently the political importance of the project for member countries. As a result of the crisis, I mean, Europe paid a very big price in economic, political, social terms, but the Maastricht construction was further developed, strengthened, and it is very different from what it was pre-2008-9. Now, let me move on now to discuss the present and the future, the more recent. Take a look back and see what happened to the world in the last 30 years. I mean, after the end of the Cold War. I think there are two main things that come out of the period between '89 and the more recent years. One is the prevalence of neoliberal economic ideas, market over state, which led to liberalization and essentially to what we now call globalization. For that globalization, there are three protagonists. One is Thatcher, the other is Reagan, as the protagonist of the neoliberal revolution, and the Chinese premier who opened China to the global markets. I mean, globalization could not have been possible without all three of them, because globalization now has included a country run by a Communist Party that has achieved the greatest rates of growth ever in history. I mean, Chinese GDP per capita increased 70 times in 40 years. This has not happened in human history. I remember once I was in Beijing, and I was talking with a guy who was the head of the think tank, international relations think tank of the Communist Party. And he had a PhD from Harvard, which at that time was more rare. I mean, now it's more often. But it was after 2000, a few years after 2000. And to have a PhD from Harvard meant that he had the blessing of the party, without any doubt. I mean, at that time, not that many Chinese were allowed to go and study in Western universities. So we were discussing all sorts of things. And then at some point I asked him, I said, what do you think is the main danger for you? I mean, you're doing very well. You have extraordinary rates of growth. I mean, China is changing. What do you think is the greatest danger? And he said, growing inequalities. He spotted right. I mean, inequalities, growing inequalities is one of the biggest problems facing the Chinese party and the Chinese society. Hence also Mr. Xi's emphasis on dealing with inequalities in the last 2 or 3 years. It's one of the biggest priorities of the Chinese Communist Party today. And then I said, okay, but can you explain to me why is it that China's transition to the market has been so successful and Russia's transition to the market economy has been, so and so, this is to put it diplomatically. Oh, he said, the answer is simple. I said, why? Tell me. Why is it simple? Oh, he said, look, I mean, the Russians have no historical experience of the market. They moved straight from feudalism to communism. And when they decided to open up, liberalize, there was no experience. While in China, the market is part of our DNA, said a Chinese communist. The market is part of the Chinese DNA. And if you travel in Asia, you know why. I mean, virtually all Asian countries, the merchant class consists mostly of Chinese. You go to Indonesia, you go to the Philippines, you go to Malaysia, most Asian countries, East Asia, the merchants are Chinese. And these have been for many, many years. Okay, so neoliberal revolution for the last 30 years. What was the other characteristic? of the last 30 years is US hegemony, undisputed. This is what international relations theorists call the unipolar moment that lasted for about 30 years. US undisputed hegemony over an increasingly rapidly globalizing world. I believe that both those things, the neoliberal revolution and US hegemony, have come under increasing challenge in recent years. I believe, in fact, we are witnessing the end of an era in both respects. The neoliberal model has come under growing challenge, and so has US hegemony in the world. Now, why? First of all, the neoliberal model has come under challenge for a variety of reasons. First of all, because it has become increasingly clear that the gains from globalization are very unevenly distributed, not so much between countries, but within countries. And this is something that many people have not realized at the beginning. The effects of globalization on Western societies have been highly unequal. If you don't understand that, you don't understand why Trump was elected to the presidency of the United States. And you don't even understand why Brexit happened. The losers from globalization voted in large numbers in favor of Trump and in favor of Brexit. They voted essentially against the system. Now, whether it was a wise choice or not, whether if you are a blue-collar worker that has lost his job or has experienced a decline in income over 30 years and you believe that Trump will save you is a different question. But that's what you did. So, growing inequalities within countries. Second, the financial crisis that put an end to the belief that financial markets were rational and stable. If you believe that, you will believe anything. If you just read a bit of financial history, you know that financial markets have never been stable and have never been rational. The other thing, climate change. Climate change is the biggest market failure in economic terms. The provision, the protection of world climate is a global public good par excellence. And public goods require public intervention, require state intervention. The market cannot deliver on its own. We can work with the market, but the market on its own cannot deliver. And then comes the pandemic, another big shock. Then health becomes a global public good. And now, last but not least, growing strategic rivalry. What we are experiencing in recent years is essentially two things. One is that the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting. Balance of power is shifting towards Asia. China is challenging US hegemony, and the US attention shifts to Asia. And it would have shifted completely to Asia had it not been for Mr. Putin, who invaded Ukraine. But even now with Ukraine, the first priority for US administration, and this is one of the very few things where there is cross-party consensus in the United States, is the fear of China emerging superpower, challenging US hegemony. So what we are experiencing, therefore, in recent years because of those changes is the return of the state. The pendulum of state market is shifting again more towards the state. The old neoliberal swing to the market is moving in the opposite direction. The emphasis is increasingly on the provision of public goods. And the other thing is, because of the geopolitical changes, security begins increasingly to take precedence over economic efficiency. the politicization of international economic exchange. Now, what does all this imply? I've got some time. For Europe and the European Union in particular, many things. Let me go through some of the, so now looking into the future, some of the main challenges facing Europe. In fact, I draw quite a lot from this book that Antonio mentioned, which officially is published next month. I worked for the last 2 years and more on this. I try to look at the bigger picture, and it covers anything from the euro to high-tech, climate, foreign policy, democracy, and short history, eclectic history of European integration. So at least I've learned, I think I've learned. And because of lockdowns, I had the luxury of spending much time at home thinking. Okay? So that was the collateral benefit, not the collateral damage of the lockdown. At least I was locked down, I produced a book. Okay, now, what are the main challenges for Europe? Let me start with the single market. Now, remember, the single market is essentially, has always been, an attempt to reconcile three things: liberalization, regulation, redistribution. The liberals thought it was only about liberalization. Thatcher approved the single market because she believed it was only about liberalization, nothing else. And that's why she was convinced by Delors to accept the introduction of more qualified majority voting in the Council. Because Delors told her, look, I mean, if we are going to have a single market, which means the elimination of barriers, if we try to do it on a unanimity basis, nothing will happen. And you want the single market, don't you? He said, a socialist to Thatcher, right? And she bought it. And what she bought was half true, because the single market has been about liberalization, but it has also been a lot about regulation. And then Delors added the structural funds and development aid. Now, it's always been an attempt to reconcile those three, but the compromise has shifted because of events. So you have to reconcile your management of the single market in the context of the state becoming more powerful and more considerations about equity than efficiency. So the optimum combination is changing. Let me give you concrete examples. Taxation. Taxation remains in the European Union one of the great absentees. Why? For the very simple reason that the treaty says that taxation decisions are taken on unanimity. And with 27 countries, you always have, if I may put it bluntly, at least one free rider who will block any attempt for tax harmonization. Now, for those of you who know anything about economics, having unconstrained sovereignty on taxation in a world where there is free movement on goods and perfect capital mobility is nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Because if you have the free movement, especially of capital, and you allow people to have free decisions on taxation, you create the conditions for unfair competition and free riders immediately. How do you change this? I think the pressures are increasing. What we have experienced in the last 30 years is two things, among others. A lowering of taxes on capital, a steady lowering of taxes on capital, and more tax evasion or tax avoidance, especially by large multinationals who can simply arbitrage between national borders. Now, in a world where you're faced growing inequalities, where you have to deal with climate change, where you have to deal with pandemics, you need taxes. Money has to come from somewhere. I mean, okay, there was a time when we borrowed at zero interest rates. This is over. So you will need more taxes. Where will taxes come from if you are in a situation in which there is unfair tax competition? Okay, so I am convinced that taxation would be one of the most important political issues in Europe already now and in the years to come. This is new. How are you going to deal with a unanimity problem remains to be seen. Then, high tech. Europe has been trying for years to play the referee in a high-tech competition in which the people who play the game are mostly American and Chinese high-tech multinationals. If you take the biggest 15 high-tech companies in the world, none is European. None. They're all American or Chinese. Now, how long can Europe play the referee in regulation in a world where the multinationals are not European? So Europe, instead of being the referee, risks increasingly becoming the grass on which American and Chinese high-tech elephants fight it out. And I can tell you, it's not going to be comfortable to be the grass. Okay? So high-tech raises the question for Europeans how they combine not only liberalization, but also perhaps forms of industrial policy. Industrial policy is resurrected from the world of the dead. What happens remains to be seen. Third big challenge. Green Europe is the next biggest project for Europe. The Commission playing a leading role. Europe is pioneer in terms of the greening of economies. But, and if it succeeds, it's going to transform not only economics, but also European politics. Now, this is challenged, among other things, first of all, because greening is easier said than done. Greening, among other things, raises distributional issues, intergenerational distribution. I mean, my generation has to incur costs and pay for investments to save the planet for your generation. Not easy to convince me to save you, unless you are my son or daughter. But for all the sons of daughters, it becomes more complicated politically. But greening is a public good. Therefore, this changes dramatically European politics. And now comes energy. Energy crisis. Europe is faced with a huge energy crisis. An energy crisis that forces Europeans not only to negotiate jointly whenever they can in dealing with suppliers, especially with Russia, but also about the sharing of costs of energy crisis. Let me move on to monetary union and the euro. We did a revolution with the recovery program to deal with the pandemic. It was a major turning point. Europe suddenly decided to spend 750 billion euros to help countries to deal with the pandemic, but also with the emphasis on greening and high-tech. Okay. And this is a hugely redistributive program. The emphasis is on the weakest economies and those most affected by the pandemic. This is why Italy is the first recipient. Now it's going to be interesting if the hard right comes to power in Italy, how this is going to affect the management of the recovery fund. Spain is one of the biggest recipients per capita, and so is my own country, Greece. So the Germans are, in a sense, subsidizing and the Swedes and others, the program in favor of the weaker economies. And this is done on the basis of mutualization of debt. Europe is spending money and it's accepting European debt. This is new. This changes the game. Whether this remains one off or it continues is the next big issue. But, you know, the management of the euro will have to face up to very difficult questions immediately. How do you steer a course between stagnation and inflation, which is really what we are faced today? Both stagnation and inflation. How much do you reform your Stability and Growth Pact, which has been put in the freezer because of the pandemic? I mean, there are no rules now. During the pandemic, there have been no rules. Countries can borrow, can run deficits, and when they borrow, most of their bonds, many of their bonds, are bought by the European Central Bank until now. All right? And then the other big issue is Europe becoming a geopolitical actor. Now, in international economic exchange, which is increasingly politicized, where sanctions are used for political reasons, and it is not only a game with China, but when we had Trump in power, it was US unilateral action that was enforced upon European allies. It was not only the Chinese or the Russians, it was the rest of the Western alliance. And there is no guarantee whatsoever that Trump or a clone of Trump will not come back to the United States in power in the next few years. So Europeans may have to prepare themselves mentally and otherwise for having to cohabit with an unpleasant occupier of the White House, as Trump was, right? I know this doesn't sound diplomatic enough, but this is the reality. And Europeans have to face up to that. Now, let me conclude because I've spoken too long. Now, we are therefore, I believe many always we believe that we are at a turning point, but this time it probably looks like a turning point. I think it looks like at the end of an era. Now, it is a time when globalization as we've known it for the last 30 years is changing at best and is moving to deglobalization at worst. Now, in that context, the forces for more European integration are very strong. That's one thing. And if this materializes, then for the first time after decades, European integration and globalization will be moving in opposite directions. This is going to be much more difficult. Number one. Number two, Europe is faced with growing pressures to take in more members. Western Balkans, but now Ukraine, Moldova. Now, enlargement has been the most successful form of European foreign policy. But let me add that the experience suggests that enlargement cannot be a magic potion to cure all ills. And if you think you have a problem with Hungary and Poland, with democracy in Hungary and Poland, then you will be too naive to believe that you will have a smaller problem with Albania, Montenegro, Ukraine, Moldova, and others. Because these countries are not ready. And if you make a political decision, which may be a good idea, then this will have implications for the European Union. And then there will be more pressure, and I'm convinced about that, for more differentiation. So my message is that if we look at the European Union in the years to come, it is likely to be more integrated and more differentiated. Namely, no ergonomics. There's no way that on many of those issues I mentioned before, we can agree on 27. It is impossible, especially when it comes to issues of security and foreign policy. So the solution is coalitions of willing and able to the extent possible, and that's the end of the story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Loukas, Professor Tsoukalis, for this really interesting and path-breaking, I would say, speech intervention. You're in good shape, I must say. There are many questions that come to my mind, of course, but no, it's not my role today to speak more than what I should speak. So I open the floor for 2-3 questions, interventions, reflections, comments for Professor Tsoukalis. Not all at the same time, please. Would like to open the floor? Yes.
Enlargement, and I mean, in many ways, and your lecture was very clear on that, the whole European project is about diluting the national sovereignty of member states, 19th century member states, right? We saw what it produced, and we decided, let's find smart ways to dilute it. My question is, what about countries which may join, definitely want to join, but they are not states in the sense of, consolidated, unified, with a common narrative, a common history? I mean, states where, some minorities want to break away, some minorities are oppressed, and these are many of the candidate countries. How do we deal with that?
Loukas, you want to take 2 or 3 questions, or you want to answer directly, straight?
Whatever you prefer. I don't mind.
It's up to you.
Okay, I'll answer this.
Okay.
I believe that enlargement has been, on the one hand, perhaps the most successful foreign policy of the European Union, but it has come at a price. And it has also not proved to be the kind of magic cure for all the problems you have domestically. Remember now, we've been talking for years, the Western Balkans, that include 5 republics that came out of former Yugoslavia, that have problems of frontiers, problems of minorities, imperfect statehood and all the rest, and somehow we believe that if they only join the European Union, the problem will magically disappear. Well, it will not, because what we have today is a relatively weak European center, a lot of divisions inside the European Union, and all that can turn into the model of dysfunctionality. But at the same time, can you afford to leave the Western Balkans or Moldova or Ukraine out of the picture? No, I believe that, of course, this is not an easy thing. George mentioned countries with imperfect statehood. But we already have some countries that are already members of the European Union, had a similar experience, all right? I believe that the only way to deal with it is a combination of 3 things. One is to strengthen the center in Brussels. So if you want to have an empire that functions, you need a capital, okay, that has more powers. Second, it has to be stage-by-stage integration, not full. I mean, with all due respect, I don't see Montenegro becoming a full member of the European Union for many years to come. But what could change is Montenegro, once and I'm taking Montenegro for no particular reason, I can talk about other countries as well. Montenegro fulfilling conditions and then becoming part of the acquis for that bit. But that coupled with more aid. So you increase the carrots also. Because today what happens is that if you look at the amount of money you pay pre-accession countries, this is peanuts to what they get once they become full members. So you have to narrow that gap. So if it's going to be stage-by-stage integration, then that means you have to provide more carrots in the process. You know, this is not usually said because it is not politically correct. So we say it behind when the microphones are shut, but we don't say it in public. But we know, we all know. I mean, let's say Ukraine is going through an awful experience, okay? It's terrible what happens there. But Ukraine was a dysfunctional state and a very corrupt state even before Putin invaded. And even if the war were to stop tomorrow by some kind of miracle, Ukraine would not become a country that can play the game and adopt the acquis. It will take years for that to happen. So you have to think out of the box. You have to create conditions of half membership, conditions where you join there and you help them economically. This therefore means a more differentiated Europe, but I think this is already the trend. So let's go further with that.
Okay, more questions, comments? Yeah, okay, that's perfect. Professor Mayora would like to step in as well, but are you okay? So, would like to start? This lady over there. Yeah, you need the mic because we are recording the whole session. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, sure.
I'm Clara, and I was wondering, Professor, you mentioned Brexit as one of the major setbacks in European integration. I just wanted to ask you whether you think there's a possibility for the UK to re-enter the Union, and if not the UK, maybe Scotland specifically.
As we have a couple of hands up, can we join 2-3 questions and then? Okay, is that okay with you guys? Yeah. Okay. So there was another hand over here, I think. And another one there. So here, yeah. Could you please introduce yourself?
Do you hear me? Yes,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Max, I'm from Germany, and I want to ask another question which is related to a bit of future prediction and the international conflict or possible conflict between China and the US and how Europe might position itself in this, how dangerous it might be for especially supply chain integration and economic integration of European companies and countries with regards to China, and if it is a sensible strategy to disentangle European economies from China, the US, both. How should Europe position itself within this majorly economic but also maybe a military conflict in the future?
Okay, thank you. So we have another person who would like to step in the discussion. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I am from the United States. And in the light that U.S. hegemony is being challenged at the moment, and while Europe is considering further enlargement into the Balkans and into Eastern Europe, can Europe afford to wait on enlargement and leave those countries to fall potentially under Chinese or Russian sphere of influence while Europe tries to figure out its own problems? Or should its focus be placed on furthering that enlargement, making sure they'll stay under EU sphere of influence?
Okay, there's another one. Okay, there, yeah. Hadn't seen you. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Loukas. First, I would like, regarding the enlargement of the EU, I would like to know your view about the recent speeches of President Macron talking about the European political communities, which in other ways, is the idea of the Europe at two velocities, which he said is a way of solving this dilemma between unanimity and efficiency and the enlargement of the European Union. So what I would like to know is if you see that this idea is solving this dilemma, if it will be feasible and possible on the future.
Okay, Loukas.
Okay, now Brexit, Scotland. The Brexit has been a traumatic experience for the UK. I believe that it was an accident waiting to happen from Maastricht onwards, because from Maastricht onwards, the UK was accumulating opt-outs, one after the other, and it was increasingly marginalizing itself in the context of the European Union. And then Cameron came and thought that, the best way would be to have a referendum, and he arrogantly believed that he never loses elections and referendums, so he would win that one and continue. And we know the result. Now, the Brexit negotiations were also an interesting experience because it reversed history. Because for the first time, the UK tried to play divide and rule in Europe, and it ended up with a European Union that was united and with the UK being divided. And the result of that was that the negotiating power was totally asymmetrical. Brussels imposed the agenda. Now, the Brexit has opened the Pandora's box. It has contributed to opening the Pandora's box in a country that was already increasingly divided. Now, if Scotland decides eventually to leave the UK, this is going to be an earth-shattering revolution, because remember, the next would be Northern Ireland. So the United Kingdom will no longer be united. I hope for the new king that all that does not happen under his reign. It wouldn't be fun. Poor guy. Scotland, one of the reasons that is seeking independence is because it wants to join the European Union. Because remember, in the referendum, there was a clear majority of the Scots to remain and not to leave. But it's difficult to speculate. Of course, if Scotland decided to leave, it would be a much stronger candidate for membership than any other candidate today. Could be a natural partner. In a funny way, if you think about it, because it applies also to Spain. European integration can have a disintegrating effect inside countries. Because what would have been nonsensical economically for Scotland independent no longer becomes nonsensical for Scotland as a member of a European Union. Okay? So the existence of the European Union makes it easier for parts of member countries to ask for independence, because independence is totally tied to membership of the European Union. The same thing applies to Catalonia. So Catalonia, in that respect, has many things in common with Scotland. So this is peculiar if you think about it, that European integration may help disintegrating member countries. It hasn't done so far, luckily. All right? Now, our German friend and about US and China. I said that one of the very few things that commands cross-party support in Washington is the fight against China. Okay? This is where Republicans and Democrats agree. Now, of course, there are many things in China that are pretty unpleasant. There's no doubt about it. This is a totalitarian state. Okay? We know that. But I think we should also know that there is a limit up to which you can export your values to other countries and to other systems. And there's also something else. If the United States decides to take the confrontation with China to a higher degree by trying to cut China increasingly off global markets, then remember that US interests are not necessarily the same as European interests, because Europe is much more dependent on trade and global markets than the United States. To give you an illustration, exports as a percentage of GDP for the whole of the European Union are a bit over 20%. For the United States, they are 11%. China is comparable to Europe, but not the United States. So the US can afford more autarky. The cost will be very high. The cost of, if you go deglobalization the hard way, it's going to be very high. And I think it doesn't make sense, politically or economically. But it makes even less sense for the Europeans than it does for the Americans. Okay? So that would be my answer. Now, enlargement, Balkans. Yeah, the Balkans is an area where outside powers have been playing a political game and buying influence increasingly in recent years. And this is true of Russia, this is true of China, and this is also true of Turkey. Okay. Now, Europe, the European Union, cannot afford to ignore the Balkans. But at the same time, I come back to what I said before. It cannot simply say that the solution to the problem is bring them all in. So my stage-by-stage integration should be the answer, and more money. It will be costly, it will cost us money. You know, foreign policy in today's world is costly. And it's not easy, politically, to try to convince. I mean, you know, you have poor governments now in Europe that have to convince their electorates that while energy prices are going through the roof and everything else, you also have to increase expenditure on defense. You may have to increase expenditure on foreign aid. Now, it's not easy for a politician to sell all that stuff. Huh? It's not popular. So it's going to be difficult politics in the years to come. And remember, this is also the time when we're dealing with fragmented societies and the rise of nationalism in a number of European countries, notably Italy, that will have elections very shortly. Now, Macron. I've always been a great fan of Macron for his European policies much more than for his domestic policies. I think that Macron, in fact, is the only guy in Europe who has a vision, a concrete proposal, and the relative weight. Nobody else is comparable to Macron, at least in his first term. Now, Macron, having read history, being a very intelligent guy, knew that he first had to address himself to the Germans to get a Franco-German coalition, because that's how most European integration works. It is French who take initiatives, who try to convince the Germans, and once they are together, they try to pull everybody else, and those who may not want to join ask for opt-outs, especially when the UK was there. I mean, that's the story for the last 30 years. He did not succeed with Merkel in the beginning, but he succeeded with the recovery program. Now Macron is weakened domestically. Now the European political community, it is to some extent a similar answer to what I've been talking about, but the danger is what? That the European political community becomes empty words. You know, so you create a European political community, you invite the prime ministers once a year in gatherings in Brussels or wherever, you have photo opportunities, those leaders go back home and show how important they are because they are on the same table with Macron, Scholz, and everybody else, nothing happens. So you need to strengthen the European political community with some carrots, concrete carrots. So if that happens, I think this is the right way to go about it.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't think so. You wanted to say something? Oh, you said jump in the discussion.
Yeah, but still, I would like to welcome all the students. So remember when you were in my class, I was telling you that you should ask questions, otherwise you will continue being dumb. So, so please do it, because here you have a great chance. It's the first time that we met, and I'm learning a lot. So, and I would like the students to continue learning, asking questions. Otherwise, I will throw one.
Go ahead.
Okay. Now I'm very excited by this meeting, and really I have to say that all the insights that you gave here make me think about many other things that maybe relate to your discourse, and I would like to, for example, introduce or maybe ask you to think about this complexity that I'm going to bring here. First, so what is the role of citizens in all this process? When we talk about economic governance, we have been seeing some kind of detachment from citizens on the basis of better governance and regulation of a situation where governments really play a great role. And when I was listening to you, I grasped this kind of idea. But then I was also wanted to know, so what is the next step in this regard? Now, there are two positions. So there is one saying that what we have right now, it works, and then intergovernmental politics will solve the problem. Then now we have the other side, first the parliament, then the commission asking for a European Convention where more democracy and transparency will be displayed during that process. So now the question is, in which direction we will go? So I'm here asking you to take your crystal ball and make some kind of forecasting.
Well, I'm not a magician, but let me try. I think there is little doubt that the European project began and continued for many years essentially as an elitist project. We have to be honest about it, okay? It was the initiative initially of a very small group of Illuminati, literally Illuminati, who conspired behind closed doors and set up the first treaties. There was very little, not only public support or mobilization, but even political parties. They didn't realize what was going on, especially with the first treaties. Very little. So European integration relied on what political scientists call permissive consensus. So it all sounds like a good thing, like motherhood and apple pie, as the Americans say. But it sounded like a foreign policy issue that is left to the experts. Now, this worked for several decades until European integration became more divisive because the gains and losses were not evenly distributed. Okay? The moment single market began to expand further, the French decided to talk about the Polish plumber, where the Polish plumber was the slogan that told essentially the French population that if enlargement will mean that all the plumbers will be Poles and the French will lose their jobs and the equivalent of all the other plumbers. Okay? So it became more democratized. Now the problem, one of the problems with the European project is that the way it is presented is boring, extremely boring. And especially if intergovernmental conferences produce essentially changes in institutions. And I've tried it myself with the former constitutional treaty. Go to an audience and try to talk to them about the importance of a changing relationship between the Council, the Commission, and the European Parliament. Who gives a shit? I mean, most people don't care about those things. It's not important. This is not what affects everyday life. So, you know, you have to talk about the real issues that affect people. You have to explain to people what the stakes are today. Because the nationalists in many countries are having an easy game. Okay? They're having an easy game in Italy. I fear they may have an easy game here and in other countries as well. Right? So you have to translate European integration into concrete things that affect human beings, citizens, in their everyday life. Are we ready for a new treaty? If a new treaty means a long process of negotiation, referendums, and unanimity, the answer is no. Because it is guaranteed that it will never go through. Because today, having referendums on whether it is day or night today will never produce unanimity in Europe. I mean, this is the state of play where that's the world we live in. We have increasingly fragmented societies and many demagogues around because that's the product of difficult times. Right. I think the only way, if we want to have changes, is to have treaties that apply to willing and able countries. And those who don't want, stay out. I am all in favor of having referendums, but on the condition that you decide for your country, not for everybody else, right? So if a country does not want, if the population, the majority of the population of the country does not want to join the next project, they stay out, but they don't stop the others from going ahead. Of course, there can be no European Union without a minimum of France, Germany, possibly Italy, Spain, and a few others, okay? But, I mean, Hungary of Orban would not join anything. We can't have an agreement on anything on foreign policy because Orban will have a footnote or will have an objection. And it becomes ridiculous. If we want to be a foreign policy actor, we believe that we're going to have statements with 27 unanimously agreeing. It's a joke. It's very good. I think it's a huge progress that the German government, in fact, it's part of the coalition document. It says that Germany is in favor of majority voting in foreign policy. That's very important. But we have to tell people what it means. My own country, which is in favor of European integration, the government still insists on unanimity in foreign policy. And I tell them in public all the time, man, come on, I mean, this is total inconsistency. You believe honestly that the European can be a foreign policy actor with unanimity? Okay, so we may need some more radical decisions in the years to come, but I fear this is not going to be easy at all. Putin may help us to unify, but it remains to be seen. And the trouble is that you have weak governments. They are all weak governments because of the problems domestically.
Okay, thank you very much. Just might I take advantage of the fact that I'm the moderator tonight to go back to your comparison. Just you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but between Russia and China, you mentioned that the main reason why the Chinese have developed an important capitalist market, is because it's ingrained in their cells, not Russia. But you forget about political power. And maybe the other reason why they were able to develop that market, it was because of communism. Of a strong political power at the center, which doesn't happen to be the case in Russia, unless you think that Putin government is political power is just an oligarchy, which is very different from what we have in China. Do you think about that? So maybe what we need for dealing and managing a big market as the Chinese is a strong power at the center.
Well,
I'm not saying communism, but...
the transition to the market in Russia was a disaster. And in that disaster, Western advisors, and especially advisors from the United States, played a very important role. I put it bluntly, but that's what happened. The Russian oligarchs are the product of a situation in which a small number of people with connections, with political connections, got control of all the main resources of Russia. It was one of the biggest political scandals, and this was called privatization. I mean, it was a joke, right? The Chinese didn't do it this way. So in that respect, the Chinese Communist Party has been much wiser and more independent. Now, do I draw the conclusion that you need a Communist Party to run the transition to the market economy? That's a very dangerous thing to say. I think, to put it bluntly, I may be politically incorrect. I don't like the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, I wouldn't like to live there. But if I were Chinese and had experienced the radical change of my standard of living and of my conditions in the last 30 years, I might have some respect for the Chinese Communist Party because it's changed my life, right? And I think that without centralized control, China would have fallen apart. China would not have made the transition. Can the Chinese Communist Party now gradually adjust? Because with capitalist market, you also need more freedom, more pluralism. I think it's one of the big challenges and questions for the Chinese. But to somehow simplify things, as, for example, even Biden comes and says, this is the fight between democracies and autocracies. Well, again, I will be politically incorrect. Are we serious? First of all, does the camp of democracies include Saudi Arabia and other wonderful allies we have on the Western side? Is it as simple as that? I mean, of course, there are many things in China I don't like. I remember I had an amazing experience in 2019. I went as a tourist with the family, and we were in Shanghai. And we took a guide to show us a few things one day. And we were in the center, and we were crossing, a pedestrian crossing, and because I'm Greek and I'm not very disciplined, I saw the red light, but I looked around, there was no traffic, so I decided to cross. Oh, she said, don't do that. Well, I said, come on, I mean, there's nobody here, there are no cars. Oh, she said, but there are cameras all over. And I said, what happens with the cameras? Oh, she said, if you are Chinese, you will receive a month later a notice from the government saying that you were identified through the cameras, face recognition, that you were crossing this pedestrian crossing illegally. The fine is so much, and we have already withdrawn the sum from your bank account. This is this is horror story, okay? So these are some of the negative aspects of a totalitarian state. But the picture is complicated rather than so simple between democracies and autocracies. And also, let me become even more provocative. If you are British and you have done what you have done to China in previous centuries, you should be a bit more modest in making preachings about human rights. Yeah, this is my provocative statement.
I agree. Okay, thank you very, very much for this thought-provoking intervention, speech. Thank you very much, Professor Loukas Tsoukalis. Please give to him an applause. Okay, and now we are going to go for the second part of this event. It's a more relaxing part, I hope, at least. I hope for you, not particularly for me, because I don't know if Julie is on. Julie, can you hear us?
Yes, hello everybody, I'm here.
Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Can we have image? No, we can't, no, because we lose voice. Okay. So, hi, Julie. Julie is in Nice right now. She is stuck there because of the, as I said, the air controllers strike. Thank Julie for being there and for waiting patiently to interview.
No, it's an honor.
I guess you want to say some words.
Yes, first, thank you for inviting me. And I listened to all the conference, it was extremely interesting for me too. I will just say a few words about the piece I will play. Because I'm not sure you told them, but I'm a cellist. I work in Opéra de Paris. And I will play some pieces because classical music composers of all times have been inspired by their travels in Europe. Europe, as you know, is extremely rich musically due to its cultural diversity. I will start with a caprice by Joseph-Marie Clément d'Alabaco, who is a Belgian cellist and composer of Italian origin. He was born in 1909, so he traveled to England. Then he moved to Verona in the Republic of Venice. So I think he has some idea about European travel. Then I will continue with Jean-Sébastien Bach, that everybody know, who is German composer. I will play 2 dances from the first cello solo suite. He's from the Baroque period, as you probably know, and he's one of the most famous composers in the world, and his work cross time and cultures. Then I will play the Song of the Bird from Pablo Casals. Pablo Casals, he's a very famous cellist. He performed this song of the Bird, in 1971 at the General Assembly of the United Nations when he received the UN Peace Medal. He was 94 years old, and before he began playing, he said, "I have not played the cello in public for many years, but I feel that the time has come to play again. I'm going to play a melody from Catalan folklore, El cant dels ocells, the song of the birds. Birds sing when they are in the sky. They sing peace, peace, peace. And it's a melody that Bach, Beethoven, and all the greats would have admired and loved. What is more, it is born in the soul of my people, Catalonia." Okay, so this was the word of Pablo Casals. Then I will play a piece, a flamenca, from Juliego Uguel Itaguel. He was Spanish composer, born in Barcelona in 1882. He traveled to Paris and worked there and collaborated with other artists. Then I will play a little Irish jig. The jig is a form of lively folk dance, and it is most associated with Irish music and dance. But there is many different type of jig in Europe. There is the French jig, the Italian jig, the Spanish jig, so it's interesting. And to finish, of course, I will play from Ludwig van Beethoven, Ode to Joy, from the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which is the European anthem. That's it. It's around 20 minutes, I think.
Okay, okay, that's perfect. Julie, thank you very, very much for being there. We cannot see you, but we can hear you well. And so Julie has recorded during the whole day. She's been working on this, and she sent us her recording, and now we are going to watch it and see it and hear it, I hope. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can have Julie with voice and image for a little 2 or 3 minutes. Yes? Are you there, Julie?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julie. An applause, please. It's been a great performance. I thank you very much for your efforts to making this happen. It's been a hectic day, as you can imagine. When Julie wrote me a couple of days ago saying that her flight had been cancelled, we all panicked. But this is a little bit Europe, I guess. No, I mean trying to solve problems at the very last minute. So I think we did it. You did it, Julie. Thank you very much. We solved this. And thanks again. I don't know if you want to say some final words now that we can see you.
No, just thank you. Thank you. And of course, I would prefer to play in live with you all, but it's like this, and it's also very. I mean, we are very lucky to have this technology.
Yep.
So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much once again. Thank you. Well, this is about to finish for the time being, but I have Maria Jose staring at me, so that I don't forget that I conduct you to the cocktail party that we have now. Where is it exactly, Maria Jose? Downstairs, right, I think in the canteen, okay? So I expect you, all of you there. I thank you very, very, very much for having been here tonight, sharing this European moment with all of us. I thank you, Loukas, Tsoukalis, for being here in Spain, in Madrid with us today. This is a very special moment for us. Professor Siotis has been behind the scenes, making this happen and possible. Thank you, George, for your kindness and your efforts again. Juan Antonio Mayoral is there texting. I'm sure that in Twitter, he's twittering everything. No, I guess. Thank you all, and I want to give a special thanks to Maria Jose Funes, who is there and who is the real actor behind the scenes. She has been key to organizing all this event this evening. So thank you very much, Maria Jose, and thank you all.